Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Laura Cohen, and I'm the Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York in Bayside, Queens. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. Today's talk is entitled Outlawing Homosexuality in Nazi Germany, Reflections on the Film Bent, and features our guest speakers, Dr. Jake Newsome, scholar and author of Pink Triangle Legacies, Coming Out in the Shadow of the Holocaust, and Dr. Kerry Whigham, assistant professor of genocide and mass atrocity prevention at Binghamton University and co-director of its Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention. The Kupferberg Holocaust Center in Bayside, New York, is situated on the traditional land of the Mantinecock people who continue to live here today. We offer gratitude and respect to all of the indigenous people of Turtle Island, past, present, and future, including the Lenape and Shinnecock peoples. What I just read is what we call a land acknowledgement. This is a statement recognizing that the land we all occupy in the course of our daily lives, including our schools, jobs, parks, and homes, as well as the names of towns and roads, were first inhabited by another group of people who were forcibly expelled and murdered. Today, we identify those crimes for what they are: mass atrocities and genocide. These horrors continue to have devastating political, social, psychological, economic, and environmental impacts upon and within Native American and Indigenous communities. This event today is part of a special collaboration between the KHC and the QCC CUNY LGBTQIA+ Consortium in a semester-long project entitled Performance is Prevention. Programming of the QCC chapter of the CUNY LGBTQIA+ Consortium is made possible due to generous funding from the New York City Council Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, Queer, Intersex, and Asexual Caucus and the Office of the Mayor, and is supported by the LaGuardia and Wagner Archives. QCC promotional partners for this programming include the Ally LGBTQIA+ Club, the LGBTQIA+ Faculty and Staff Association, and the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning, also known as CETL. The event is also co-sponsored by several organizations outside of Queensborough, including the Ray Walpole Institute for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity at Western Washington University, the Center for the Holocaust Studies at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, the Holocaust and Humanities Center in White Plains, and the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University. After the presentation, please be sure to submit your questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And to kick things off, please join me in welcoming Professor Heather Huggins, Associate Professor of Speech, Communication, and Theater Arts, and coordinator of the LGBTQIA+ Consortium's Performance as Prevention Project. Professor Huggins, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Laura. I also want to extend our appreciation to Marissa Hollywood, Associate Director of the KHC, who is supporting today's webinar. So as Laura shared, my name is Heather Huggins, and I'm actually with my colleague, C. Julian Jimenez, and our students here today. I wanted to share a little bit about the inspiration for this series, the Spring 2024 Performance as Prevention events. Last year, I was a Charles E. Scheidt Faculty Fellow at the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention at Binghamton University. I learned about the urgent need for multidisciplinary engagement in prevention. I began reflecting about how our campus community might engage with existing works of art with a prevention lens. I shared this with Julian, and we immediately thought of Bent, written by Martin Sherman, a Jewish American playwright. Sherman's process offers insights about art as an archive. He worked on the project in the 1970s when little was known about the persecution of homosexual men during the Nazi regime. Sherman's inspiration actually came from a passing reference to the pink triangle symbol in the script as time goes by. The lack of English language resources led Sherman to the archives at the Wiener Holocaust Library in London. He was invited to premiere the play actually at a small venue called the Sweatshop, but folks caught wind of the development and it encouraged him to share it more widely. This led to a premiere in London's West End in 1979, followed by a Broadway run in 1980. Bent was eventually released as a major motion picture in 1997. Sherman later shared that he wrote it for a small theater about a subject that hadn't been talked about. He never in a million years dreamed that it would be in a position to make that subject known to the world. Editor-in-chief of American Theater magazine, Rob Weidert Kent, wonders if this may account for the play's sexual frankness and formal ambition, not to mention its unflinching depiction of Nazi sadism. Sherman also documented the social liberation that existed in Berlin prior to the rise of the Nazis, as well as the powerful forces that turned against the queer community. For example, the first large burning of books staged by the Nazis was the burning of the materials at the Institute of Sexual Research. The institute was founded in 1919 by Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, a gay Jewish doctor living in Berlin. The institute provided research, services, and gender-affirming care to the queer community. It also attempted to educate everyday people. Hirschfeld was called into activism and advocacy when one of his own patients committed suicide the night before he was to marry a woman. He couldn't face the required marriage or telling his parents that he was gay. Hirschfeld cited this tragedy as the catalyst for his work. This is our landscape for today's event, Outlawing Homosexuality in Nazi Germany, Reflections on the Film Bent. We are grateful to be joined today by two guest scholars so we can learn more about this history and the relevance of its themes for today. Dr. Jake Newsome is an award-winning scholar of German and American LGBTQ+ history, whose research and resources educate global audiences. He is the founder and director of the Pink Triangle Legacies Project, which honors the memory of the Nazis' queer victims and carries on their legacy by fighting homophobia and transphobia today through education, advocacy, and empowerment. His book, Pink Triangle Legacies: Coming Out in the Shadow of the Holocaust, tells the dynamic and inspiring history of the LGBTQ+ community's original pride symbol. It traces the transformation of the Pink Triangle from a Nazi concentration camp badge into a widespread emblem of queer liberation, pride, and community. He lives in San Diego with his husband and son. Dr. Kerry Whigham is an assistant professor of genocide and mass atrocity prevention at Binghamton University and co-director of its Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention, IGMAP. His first book, Resonant Violence, Affect, Memory, and Activism in Post-Genocide Societies, is published by Rutgers University Press. He received a PhD in performance studies from New York University. In addition to his academic work, he is the director of research and online education at the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities, an international non-governmental organization that works with over 90 countries around the world on creating public policy for the protection of vulnerable groups and the prevention of mass atrocities. We've asked Jake and Kerry to each share a short presentation, and then we'll discuss the themes of Martin Sherman's Bent. I'd like to welcome Jake.
Thank you so much for that. And good morning or good afternoon, I guess, depending on where you're logging on from. I'm really grateful to have this space, to have this conversation with all of you. As you know, you're aware, there are school boards across the country right now that are really trying to control, ban, or rewrite instruction on how both Holocaust history and LGBTQ topics are approached in the classroom. And so I'm just really thankful for the whole spectrum of and coalition of partners that have made this space and this event possible. I think these are really important conversations that we can have together as a society. I am absolutely thrilled to be here today to talk about Bent. What an incredible play and then movie. Just a sheer force of storytelling, the power of storytelling. And I want to start off today by reading a passage from my book, actually, talking about one particular community's reaction to the play Bent. So if you don't mind, I'd just like to read this paragraph here. For theater goers in the small English town of Havant, the fall of 1983 caused quite a buzz in the local art scene. For a week in September of that year, the local Bench Theater ran a production of a play called Bent. It was a tragic love story about the fate of gay German men during the early years of the Third Reich. The theater received outspoken criticism for putting on a production that allegedly promoted sin and immorality. One Havant resident wrote a letter to the editor of the local newspaper expressing a hope that the good people of their town would not support the show. The letter's writer wrote, "Of course, homosexuality occurs in the world. So does diarrhea, but I don't like to watch it." 1 week later, another resident wrote in, "I agree with the letter last week from L. Wilton concerning the play about homosexuals to be put on at Havant. Who could be entertained by a play about Nazis or homosexuals?" Well, as it turns out, tens of millions of people worldwide could be and were entertained by the play. As we'll see as we have this conversation today, the play Bent and the subsequent movie was a monumental watershed moment in queer history, and not just queer history in the 1970s, but it was a critical moment in shining a light back onto queer history that had been erased for decades after the end of the Holocaust. And in fact, as I was beginning my research for my book, it's all about how different German and American societies remembered or collectively forgot the Nazis' persecution of LGBTQ folks. Everyone that I talked to said, "Oh, have you seen Bent? I learned about it from Bent. Bent, Bent, Bent." And so it was clear to me that a central part of my work was going to have to look at Bent. And so I suddenly came to this reflection point, though, because as Professor Huggins mentioned, the play came out in 1979. At that time, there was essentially no historical scholarship available, at least in English, on the Nazi persecution of, well, at the time would have been called the Nazi persecution of homosexuals. And so it became a question for me: how did Martin Sherman seemingly know enough about this history to write a script and put on a play that it was actually quite historically accurate, for not having access to historical archives and scholarship. And in fact, I wasn't the only one who had some of these doubts. Here's a quote from someone from 1980, a theater goer in Toronto when the play came to Toronto. He said, "I had no idea about the persecution of homosexuals in the Nazi camps. In fact, I thought Martin Sherman had fabricated it." But he was a journalist there in Toronto, and he said, "Only later, when I did an interview with Martin Sherman, I learned that the script was based on fact." And again, this opens up kind of questions about how do we, as communities, relate to and tell our histories in the face of a lack of historical scholarship. And it turns out, of course, Professor Huggins mentioned that Sherman did his own research at the Wiener Library and Archives, but Sherman also mentions that a particular article in the gay press that clearly wasn't available in any of the mainstream academic presses was really influential for him. And I have a copy of that here. I'm going to see if I can fit it all on the screen. It was a 1974 article by a man named Jim Steakley called "Homosexuals in the Third Reich." And this was the very first article written in English that provided historical factual details about the Nazi persecution of primarily of gay men. And this one kind of pretty short article ended up being an inspiration for Martin Sherman, who went on to write this play that was monumental for gay communities, not just in London and America, but also in West Germany. And so one of the things that I've wanted to point out and can be the basis of some of our conversation is that this type of I love the phrase "art as archive." This type of play as an archive, as a way of collecting and presenting a community's history, didn't happen in West Germany, right? The land where the Holocaust actually happened. And Martin Sherman talked about being a little bit nervous about whether the play would make it to West Germany, and whether or not it would be a hit there. And so the same year that it premiered on Broadway, it also was translated into German and made its way onto German stages under the title Rosa Winkel, which just translates to Pink Triangle. And I have one quote here that I'd like to read from one of a German theater critic who wrote in his newspaper that, quote, "It's actually very shameful that the American playwright Martin Sherman, who is unknown over here in Germany, had to come and bring the horrible persecution and extermination of homosexuals during the Nazi time to our stages." And so here we see a West German talking about the fact that why should it be and essentially a foreigner who is brave enough to tackle this history and then bring it back to Germans. And part of that was the fact that the German mainstream historical profession had just essentially silenced this history for decades. No museum or history department or academic journal would publish or fund research about this topic. And so this is what I want to end with. My opening remarks is that always from its inception, Martin Sherman's play Bent and the movie afterwards was never solely about entertainment, right? It was about capturing and writing a piece of history that historians had ignored. And so it was always meant to be an educational experience as much as an entertainment experience. And one of the things that I think just really drives this point home is the fact that in Germany, the playbills for the play, you might have 1 to 2 pages where they list the actors, the director, but the rest of the maybe 20 to 30 pages of those playbills were all academic articles written by historians, by gay historians, really kind of grassroots historians who had gone into the archives and done this research, and no other publication would publish their research. And so they saw this moment of, hey, there's going to be thousands of people coming to see this play. Let's use this as an opportunity to share with them archival evidence that shows the reality of what happened. And so this just shows how art and fiction oftentimes go hand in hand with historical research to help us as a community understand where we've come from. And so I'm looking forward to discussing this further with you, but I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Kerry.
Thanks so much, Jake. It's an honor to be here with you all. I want to begin in the same vein as Laura began by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from Binghamton University, which is on the ancestral territory of the Oneida and Onondaga nations, 2 groups that have survived and resisted the genocidal processes of genocide throughout history and continue to do so today. I want to extend a special thanks to Heather, Laura, and all of the other organizers of this event for inviting me to participate. So I come at this, as a scholar and a practitioner that's working on the prevention of genocide and mass atrocities. So my interpretation and what I'm going to talk about right now is how we can think of Bent as something that can help us and tell us something about what we need to do when we're thinking about preventing these crimes. So first, to do that, I just want to situate, understand how do we situate the story of Bent and the persecution of gay men and other members of the LGBTQI plus communities by the Nazis. How do we situate that within this broader spectrum of understanding genocides and mass atrocities? So first of all, it's important to say that genocide is its own legal category, thanks to the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which was signed into law, and it was the first treaty of the newly formed United Nations in 1948. And what's important to note is that actually there are only certain groups of people, types of identity groups, that are protected by the Genocide Convention. So legally speaking, there are only certain groups that can experience genocide, and those are racial, religious, national, or ethnic groups. So you'll notice right away that actually people who are persecuted because of their gender identity or sexual orientation, those are not protected by the Genocide Convention. So legally speaking, they cannot be subject to genocide. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that they can't be subjected to their attempted destruction. And whether we call it genocide or not doesn't mean that it's not experienced as genocide by those groups of people. But we also have this broader category that we call mass atrocities, which is an umbrella term that includes genocide, but it also includes two other categories of crimes: crimes against humanity and war crimes. Crimes against humanity are about, this is a category of crime that talks about widespread and systematic persecution of civilian populations. And among those groups, and usually those are populations that are defined by their identity. And of course, among those groups of people that experience those crimes against humanity are sexual minorities and members of the LGBTQI plus communities. And so we can definitely, even if this legal category of genocide doesn't extend to what we see and witness in the film Bent, this idea of crimes against humanity absolutely defines what is being experienced. And what's important to note is that also, legally speaking, there's actually no hierarchy among those crimes. So even though we think often about genocide as being the crime of crimes, legally speaking, that hierarchy does not exist. And crimes against humanity are absolutely as grave and as serious as genocide. So we can think about the persecution of primarily gay men, but also other members of the LGBTQI plus community during the Nazi regime as existing alongside and in the same logic as the Holocaust and as the genocide of the Roma, which are these two groups of people who fit within the more traditional and legal understandings of what a genocide is. And they're connected because all of these groups are being persecuted and targeted because of their identity, because of who they are. And if we want to understand how to prevent those types of crimes, large-scale identity-based violence, including genocide, including crimes against humanity, then first and foremost, what we have to do, and what the practitioner and scholarly community sees, is that we have to understand that persecution not as something that happens overnight, but as a long-term social and political process that doesn't start with attempted extermination or annihilation, but starts with much earlier stages, smaller steps. And when we learn to recognize those smaller steps, maybe there's opportunity to intervene long before things escalate to the point of mass killing or mass extermination. And what Bent does, I think, is it does exemplify for us, but the film and the play exemplify for us what that process can look like, because we see in the film those processes of classification where people are divided based on their identity. Symbolization, which is when those identities are given a physical marker that people wear. And the pink triangle that Jake has already mentioned is a really good example of that symbolization, how targeted groups are made to wear something that actually shows which of the targeted groups they belong to. Dehumanization. We see in the film, for instance, Clive Owen's character Max being shaved and deloused, disinfected, and tortured as a way of dehumanizing him, of making him seem less human and therefore easier to kill. Persecution, where groups of people, gay men in this case, are being arrested and put into these concentration camps and work camps. And then finally, we actually see at the end the acts of killing, which is towards the end of this process of genocide. So we see all of these things playing out in Bent, but one thing that's really interesting about the film and the play is that actually it shows us how very quickly the picture changed for queer communities under the Nazi regime, compared perhaps to the way that it played out in a bit more of an incremental manner for other targeted identity groups. Because while the film, for instance, begins with this image of what Berlin looked like before, that we see this kind of vibrant queer life in Berlin that would ultimately take decades to reestablish itself after the end of the Nazi regime. We also see how very quickly gay communities are targeted, and how quickly this experience plays out for the character of Max and Horst in this film. And that's not necessarily the way that it played out for other groups of people who were targeted. So for instance, the film is starting in 1934 on the night of the Long Knives. But already at that point, Hitler came to power in 1933, and a whole array of anti-Jewish legislation had already been passed in 1933 before this point, where Jewish communities in Germany were seeing a much slower an incremental constriction of democratic space in their lives and of their livelihoods, whereas the film depicts it for queer communities as being a quite rapid shift towards their persecution. But one thing that I think it also illustrates that we can take to, and that applies to other cases of genocide and mass atrocity throughout history, is that in a surprising number of cases of large-scale identity-based violence, the LGBTQ plus communities actually can be seen as a canary in the coal mine, really, because they're often some of the first communities to be persecuted by these far-right or ultra-nationalist regimes that want to go back to a more traditional or conservative view of what community looks like and what the family looks like, what a society should look like. The film also demonstrates much of what we know about how victim groups or how others are created and how violence functions against how identity-based violence manifests during a lot of these regimes. So here I'm thinking about the particular cruelty of the scene with Max, Clive Owen's character, in the train car, where he's forced not only to deny his own boyfriend, right, in order to save himself in that train car from death, but then he also must participate in the torture of this man that he loves, right? And here I think it's a really compelling depiction of what Holocaust survivor Primo Levi talks about as the gray zone, this space in between that survivors in particular of the concentration camps during the Nazi regime find themselves in, where they are at once victims of the violence and also in their victimhood made to participate in that violence against other people. Levi describes it as this tactic of the Nazis, and that we see in other cases of genocide and mass atrocities as, and this is a quote, an attempt to shift onto others, specifically the victims, the burden of guilt, so that they are deprived of even the solace of innocence. And the film does a wonderful job of depicting the horror of that phenomenon. And I also think that what Bench shows us is it depicts what resistance can look like in the face of the most extreme forms of persecution. Thinking about the end of the film and some of the acts throughout the film, particularly the act where Max and Horst engage in this intimacy just without even looking or touching each other. I think about one of the other places where I work really often is in Argentina, which experienced a military dictatorship between 1976 and 1983, when a large number, tens of thousands of people were imprisoned in camps and tortured because they were deemed to be opponents to the political regime, to the military dictatorship. And one thing that survivors would often mention when they survived that experience of being in these clandestine detention and torture centers, where they were literally put into attic spaces and made to sit together, restrained with shackles, with hoods over their faces so they couldn't talk to each other, that one of the ways that they resisted that violence was actually to tell jokes to each other. Because emotions were actually prohibited in this space. They weren't allowed, because emotions made them be human. So telling jokes to each other when guards weren't around and making each other laugh was actually one of the biggest acts of resistance that they had, because it made them feel human again. And I think in Bent, that kind of resistance comes in the form of first Horst and then Max remaining true to their identities as gay men and ultimately dying because of it, because that's the form of resistance that they had to offer in this moment. And while this is really beautiful, it's ultimately what I would argue is not something that we should ever require of anyone. Perhaps the primary reason why real prevention work is so essential is because nobody should live in a world where they have to choose between holding fast to their identity and death. And such sacrifice is really beautifully moving in theater and film, as we see in Bent. But it's ultimately not something that we should ever expect or require of any human being. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to continuing this conversation going forward.
Excellent. Thank you so much. This is Julian Jimenez. I have a question for Jake. Jake, do you see, or both of you, do you see theater as a valid way to record history, even if the characters themselves are fake?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think something that I think I struggled with that question during my research, because on the one hand, you know, um, we as historians, as scholars, are supposed to be, as objective as possible, and everything needs to have a footnote and a root in the archive in order to be, right truth. Um, However, as a gay man, there's like and as a human, I understand that there are multiple ways of conveying truth, and part of that is through art and even fiction. And one of the things that I loved that Kerry talked about is the importance of emotion and feeling, and how that makes us human. And so I do think that there is certainly a value in art like theater in promoting um, understanding of our past. I think, does every single facet of the play or of the artwork have to be, absolutely historically accurate? Well, no, because honestly, like, that's not how history works. We very rarely, even in the historical profession, have enough information to tell a full story from A to Z with every single question answered. And so one of the things that I love about Bent and others like it is the fact that Martin Sherman went and said, look, I want to tell a story like this, but it has to be based in history. And of course, that you can take artistic license to make characters Max and Horst, and give it a human story that's going to connect with people in a way that academic history wouldn't. But it is based in historical reality, and so I absolutely do think that there's not only a place for kind of big T truth in art, but it's also really necessary, because as we collectively, whether we're talking about the gay community or just kind of society in general, we piece together our understandings of the past using multiple different sources. Historians, no matter what we would like to think, we don't have a monopoly on the past. We are just one voice in a conversation that shapes how we think about history, and those other voices are artists, TV shows, books, novels. And so I think that for it's actually important for us to have multiple diverse voices coming together to try to figure out how we understand and relate to our history, because in the case of Bent, historians were completely absent of that conversation. They purposefully chose to say, you know what, we're not going to write about this because queer people weren't victims, they were criminals, they got what was coming to them. And so it took someone like a playwright to start this conversation. And you know what happened? Like, afterwards, professional historians then they joined the conversation, because they were saying, oh, well, we need to make sure this is actually what happened. And so in this case, Bent spoke a truth that had been silenced for so long that it actually started that conversation. And so, I'm just so thankful to Martin Sherman for starting that incredible conversation that ultimately just transcended national borders, and now look, we're still having this conversation.
Yeah, if I could just add on to that, I agree with Jake completely. Particularly in the cases of experiences of genocide and other atrocity crimes, there are different categories of truth that I think we need to be attentive to. And historical truth is one of them, the kinds of factual truth that historians can provide us and do provide us and should. But there's also this, the truth of the experience of living through this kind of persecution. That's equally important to understanding how the impacts of this kind of violence. Ernesto Verdeja is a great genocide studies scholar, and he talks about three kinds of truth or categories of truth that we need to think about in the aftermath of genocide and mass atrocity. There's factual truth, which is the kind of truth that historians can give us. Phenomenological truth, which is that experiential truth that we get from survivors or victims who have undergone violence and can tell us about that experience of personally living through this. And oftentimes that phenomenological truth can have much more of an impact on people than just the factual truth. And then there's also narrative truth, which is kind of how that factual truth and that experiential truth come together to form a story that we as a society tell ourselves about the past, and that also shapes the way that we make amends for that violence in the present, that shapes our behavior and how we relate to each other in the present. There's this one story that I really love that I go back to often, as particularly with my students, an essay by a psychoanalyst named Dory Laub, who writes, he and Shoshana Fellman have an amazing book on testimony and the importance of listening to victims and survivors in the aftermath of genocide. And he tells about this moment where he was with a group of historians, and they were listening to a woman who survived Auschwitz, Birkenau. And she, in her testimony or oral history, talked about this one moment where a group of prisoners rose up and actually successfully bombed one of the crematoria in Auschwitz. But what she said in her story was they bombed all 4 of the crematoria in Auschwitz, which is not true factually at all. Only one of them was destroyed. And the historians in the room said, well, we have to totally disregard this woman's testimony because she was factually wrong about this element. And Dory Laub, the psychoanalyst, said, I understand that she was factually wrong about this, but perhaps her saying that all of the crematoria was burned is also speaking to a deeper truth for this woman, that the fact that this group of prisoners successfully bombed one crematoria was such a world-changing event that to her it was experienced as if all of Auschwitz was destroyed in that moment. So there's some truth in that we have to seek out and listen to, even if it doesn't align fully with that factual truth. Now, obviously, I in saying this, I don't mean to say that we should, that everyone's truth is equally valid and that we should listen to people who are absolutely falsifying the past, right? But I do think it's important to pay attention to these stories, and particularly when we're talking about the experience of people who have been targeted. That experience, and this is what art can give us, speaks to some deeper truth that can be really important when we're deciding as a society how to reckon with that past.
Thank you so much. That's amazing. Another question. When the film opens, we see the queer community living openly in Berlin. And we also know that from historical documents that Berlin was home to a thriving trans community before the rise of the Nazis. What were the warning signs of this change?
I'll take a stab at that. I think, one of I would say a warning sign would be that really, this level of acceptance and public community building that we see in Berlin was not visible outside of Berlin. It was quite limited to the capital city. In smaller instances, maybe in some of the other larger cities like Munich and Hamburg. But if you look at the documents from the countryside, from the rest of Germany, there's actually quite a popular backlash building in letters to the editor, in newspapers, even just people writing to each other in their letters are very aware. It's not that this LGBTQ culture in Berlin is still underground or secret. It's quite well known, and Berlin is well known as a queer capital. The fact that there is the Institute for Sexual Science, which is a forerunner in trans community, trans research, trans healthcare, it's well known to Germans. They know about it, and they have horribly strong reactions against it. And so I think, looking back, of course, hindsight is always 20/20, but looking back and seeing that this level of tolerance and I'm not going to say full acceptance, but at least tolerance in the capital city, the fact that it was not shared and the fact that there was this popular backlash building meant that when the Nazis were campaigning, they knew they could tap into that homophobia and transphobia to build support, even if ordinary Germans didn't necessarily agree with with the Nazi Party's anti-Semitism or their stances on global geopolitics. The fact that they also shared homophobic beliefs, the Nazi parties could count on essentially fanning the flames of homophobia to build a coalition on the right, to kind of usher themselves into power. And so I think that one of the warning signs and the lessons of this history for me is that just because a minority group wins or gains rights or protections, it doesn't mean that those can't be immediately or quickly taken away. They have to be actively defended constantly, because they actually will, and I think that's what we're seeing today even, is sparking a backlash. When there is progress, it sparks a backlash. And so I think while we can certainly celebrate progress and the victories, we have to also keep our eye on the building backlash that will inevitably come.
Thank you. One more question for you, Jake. What do you think the reason for the division of the pink triangle to the yellow stars? Why was it so essential for people to put into groups, signalize, identifying who they were?
I think, and Kerry mentioned this in his remarks, that this is a key kind of fundamental tool of dehumanization, of othering, people, and so even inside the camps where all of the prisoners have, been dehumanized, and the fact that they're now referred to by prisoner numbers and not their name, that they're all forced to wear similar or the same uniforms, and they've had their hair shaven, they've had their possessions removed, so they've all been dehumanized. But even within this universe of dehumanization, the Nazis go further to essentially reduce all complex humanness into one single symbol of what the Nazis considered a crime. And so there was a whole color-coded spectrum of triangle badges that inmates had to wear. I mean, there was red for political prisoners, brown for the Roma and Sinti, purple for Jehovah's Witnesses, of course, yellow for Jews, and pink for the umbrella term was homosexuals, and so that would have included all men who had sex with men as well as trans women. And it was, again, a way of not only dehumanizing, but essentially divide and conquer, because within this universe, you are telling people how or why they're different, and how or why other people should view them. And we know, for example, that homophobia in the general public was a major reason that the Nazis were able to identify and persecute queer people, and that homophobia followed them into the camps. And so the prisoners with the pink triangles had to face incredible violence and discrimination, not just from the SS guards, but from fellow prisoners themselves. And so this led to, in the camps, there was kind of underground black market of goods, or people trading food for an extra blanket or whatever that might be, to help them survive. Well, because of homophobia, the men with the pink triangle were essentially excluded from those types of barter, which led to even further death. And so I think that this is just a very extreme example of othering people and dehumanization, again, when taken to its extreme.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I agree with everything Jake said completely. This is a strategy that we see enacted by perpetrators in many, many cases of genocide and atrocity, this divide and conquer strategy. And where it has been particularly visible is with the violence of colonizing regimes. So one of the best examples of this would be in Rwanda, where the Germans and then really the Belgians were the ones who took this to its full extent, were building upon these distinctions between Hutu and Tutsi ethnic groups and elevating the Tutsi to say that they're more European, they are more like us, they therefore should have more power, and ultimately creating systems that would reinforce that division between these two ethnic groups, so that the two groups would fight each other rather than turning against the colonial power, right? And then that, of course, laid part of the groundwork or foundation that would lead ultimately to the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, where the Hutus would turn and against the Tutsi and murder over 800,000 of them in a period of 100 days. So this is a strategy that we see again and again throughout cases of genocide and other forms of large-scale identity-based violence.
So, Kerry, we were wanting to also go more deeply into this idea of prevention. And I know you spoke a bit about how the Nazi persecution of gay men connects to our broader understanding of what genocide and mass atrocities are. I'm wondering if you could also speak to some of the other contexts of atrocity, where we've also seen widespread or systematic persecution of the queer communities and why they were targeted.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I like I said, in all too many cases of atrocity, queer communities, LGBTQI plus communities can be seen as a kind of canary in the coal mine, because oftentimes they're among the first groups of people to face persecution. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. One, I think they're always a fairly small percentage of the broader population, and because they're such a small minority, they can be much easier to target because they appear as a really easily eliminable portion of the society. But also, and I think maybe perhaps even more so, because so many of these genocidal regimes, they are built on this idea of going back to like traditional values, traditional family values, and therefore, like LGBTQI plus communities are seen from the very beginning as totally contrary to this new society, which is really like an imagined old society that these genocidal regimes are trying to enact. So this is where we see this real rise, both in the past but also in the present, very much so, of almost a political homophobia, where this idea of targeting of queer communities becomes the way of enacting a specific political ideology. Perhaps the clearest example of this in the present is Russia, right? Where Russia is, since 2013, passing this gay propaganda law where basically anyone talking about queerness is automatically violating the law, right? Because that's going against this idea of a traditional family values that Russia is trying to promote. And Putin actually continually talks about Europe, Western Europe, as gay Europa, right? So it's actually he's essentialized Europeanness with queerness, right? And a celebration of queerness that Russia is trying to be the opposite of. And this, of course, has manifested most clearly in the case of Chechnya, in Russia, where we see these full gay purges that were sexual orientation to be included as a group, a protected group in the Genocide Convention would be an absolutely clear case of genocide, where we see gay men being detained, tortured, and murdered in a way to purge Chechnya of all gayness, all queerness, right? Sudan, now, of course, experiencing widespread civil war, but this is nothing new in Sudan, this type of violence. Oftentimes when people think about genocide in Sudan, we think about Darfur, right? And the persecution of more southern Sudanese populations. But actually, one of the first things that happened before the genocide in Darfur in 1991, al-Bashir in Sudan passed this Public Order Act. This is what it's called, right? And it's always framed in this kind of language. That was all about publicly flogging people who defied the traditional social order. And that included, of course, women who refused to cover their heads, but it also included the queer community, absolutely, being publicly flogged. And we also see it in the aftermath of genocide and atrocities. So during the communist period of the Tito regime in the former Yugoslavia, so from the end of World War II to the 1980s, we actually saw an increase in acceptance of queer communities in the former Yugoslavia. But then when Tito, the dictator, died in 1980, and that vacuum, that power vacuum was filled by these hyper-nationalist leaders like Slobodan Milosevic, part of what they were using was that same political homophobia to create this other. So all of that progress that had been made for queer communities was totally eliminated. And it didn't go away even after the violence ended in 1995, after the genocide in Srebrenica, for instance, when all of these global organizations, NGOs, the UN stepped in to try and start these really vibrant peace building and democratization efforts in the region. But there was a really, that stigmatization of queer communities continued to the point where those groups were almost completely excluded from those peace building and democratization efforts. And there was an exclusive focus on the traditional ethnic groups in that community. So we see this exclusion of queerness also in the way that communities rebuild after genocide and atrocities. I mean, there are many more examples of this that we could talk about, but I'll stop there for now.
Thank you. I believe that Marissa was also going to share a few questions that are coming in through the webinar chat. One is such a powerful discussion. Thank you. Dr. Newsome's book is excellent. I learned so much, and my question is, please comment on the use of the word bent as a specific title. How did that title choice by Martin Sherman contribute to the discourse within the play and the film in our own time?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't have kind of a direct answer from Martin Sherman, himself. I don't know exactly what he thought, but I can offer my thoughts. That the word bent, and they talk about it in the play, as referring to not straight, as being off kilter, as being wrong. And so I think that it also makes me think of the German title of the play, as I mentioned, was Rosa Winkel, or Pink Triangle. And both the choice of both of those titles, Bent and Rosa Winkel, goes to the fact that I think points to the fact that the reason these men were targeted and were forced to experience what they did was their perceived difference. The fact that they were not straight, the fact that they were, their complexity, their identity was boiled down to this one aspect of their life, was I think what, at least one of the resounding messages of the play and the movie to me. And I think that, one of the outcomes, if we can look kind of zoomed out from a historical perspective, is that one of the implications of this play is that it helps contribute to establishment of the pink triangle, the reclaiming of the pink triangle as a symbol of pride. Because it's like, you know what, if you're going to boil me and my identity down to this one aspect, you know, and you're labeling it with this triangle as something that is shameful and worth punishing or even worth killing for, I am going to reclaim this symbol and say, you know what, being gay is in no way shameful, and in fact, I'm going to now wear this badge as a symbol of pride. And so we do have some examples of gay activists using the pink triangle a few years before Bent comes out, but really Bent and the imagery that's used on the posters, on the playbills, the fact that the pink triangle becomes such a prominent narrative point in the play really helps catapult and catapult this transformation of the pink triangle into a symbol of resistance and pride and community in the gay community across North America and Europe.
If I could just add a little bit to that, I mean, this is, I think this is such an interesting title to the play, and this is perhaps obvious to say, but to me, I mean, the real story of that play and where that title transforms, right, is that throughout the play, Bent refers to the queer community that's being persecuted. But what happens in that final speech where Max is holding up the dead body of Horst, right, and declaring his love for him, is that moment is showing that no, I mean, as if we didn't know already, but what's bent is this world that has led to this moment, that has put them in this position. That's the bent thing, right? That's the thing that deviates from what should be the norm.
Thank you for that. That leads me to a question that one of our students had posted. Sort of two questions that I'm going to combine based on what you just said. So they realized that there was a huge theme of love in the play, yet all the love had to be hidden and usually with no redemption, and how betrayal seemed to also be another theme throughout the movie, especially with Rudy and Max being captured and put in the train with the Nazis. And why is betrayal so consistent in the inner workings of the Nazis and how they used betrayal to disrupt the love that was happening in the queer community?
Okay, I'll start this time. I mean, this idea of betrayal is, I mean, we can think about this in other terms, but it is also central to every genocidal regime. And this is a great example of what Hannah Arendt talks about happening in all totalitarian regimes, which is this idea of atomization, the idea of basically dismantling the notion of community, of the idea that you belong to a larger whole. Because if we are all atomized, if literally broken apart into individual components, right? If we only see ourselves as individuals and not in connection with other parts of a community, then you can't resist anything. You can't form communities of resistance. So this is the strategy of genocidal regimes, to break people apart so they no longer see themselves as part of a bigger whole that could form that could push against the regime. So this is a very common strategy. And we could think about it as betrayal. We could think about it as isolation or atomization, but it is part of the logic of genocide to do exactly this.
So this is also one from the chat. I'm thinking of Elena Horne's film, The Lesson, where queer experience is invisible. Is there any reason for hope?
Okay,
Jake,
well, yeah.
Jake,
oh,
you
go
had a
ahead.
strong reaction, I saw. I just wanted to point that out.
You know, I feel like the historian in me is so cynical and feels like, you know, we're stuck in this loop. But I also know from this history that queer people are powerfully resilient, and I wish we didn't have to be. I wish that wasn't the case, you know. But I know that, for example, in the face of not, you know, of attempted, and again, we can debate, you know, genocide or not, legally or not, but in the face of at least cultural destruction, you know, during the Nazi regime, uh, queer people managed to survive. They managed to rebuild cultures and lives for themselves afterwards. And this is what I find most inspiring, I guess, because I am a historian, is they managed to be the protectors and the harbingers of this history when the rest of the world would have rather delete and silence and erase this history. And so it was the queer community who protected it, who you know, carried it into their attics or in their closets, and then you know, deposited them in these kind of grassroots gay archive / community centers, for scholars later to come dig through and write about. And um, any and all progress for the queer community has been driven by the queer community itself. And so I just, in the face of this, you know, the question of, is there reason for hope? That's what the oppressors want, is for us to feel incredibly hopeless. And it goes, I just, you know, goes back to what Kerry said about atomization and keeping us isolated and separate and feeling like there can be no hope. But when we build solidarity with each other and with other marginalized communities, there absolutely is hope, and we just have to really hang on to that.
Work.
So another thing that we've been discussing in our classes is that Bent shows us the lengths that Max will go to survive. And this theme, I think, that you all were referring to is the gray space. And it's easy to hope that we would be heroic under similar circumstances and that we would never exploit or harm another person. And yet, stories like this remind us that we're all vulnerable to enacting violence against others. And so we're wondering if each of you might speak to what your work offers this in terms of confronting our biases and resisting oppression.
Yeah, this is a great question. The sad reality of the situation is, and what we know, but from social psychology and genocide studies more broadly, is that there's been no genocide in history that has been wanting for perpetrators, right? There's no genocide that hasn't happened because they just couldn't find enough people who were willing to participate in killing. And by and large, the people who participated in that killing are not sadists. They're not monsters. They're ordinary people who, through an array of processes, bit by bit, were transformed into people who didn't see, who accepted a new logic of the society they lived in, where it wasn't about saying it's not wrong to kill these people. The logic actually became, it's wrong not to kill these people, right? This is the perverted logic of genocide. Still, the number of people who become perpetrators is a relatively small percentage. It's enough, but it's relatively small. The vast, vast majority of people will be bystanders in these situations. Will stand by and say, this doesn't impact me. I'm scared that if I speak up, I could be targeted, and therefore it's easier for me and my responsibility is to protect myself, my family, and say nothing. And most people will fall into this category. And we can do a lot of work to educate people, to try and make sure that they'll be so-called upstanders rather than bystanders in these situations. But it's really hard work, and it goes against a lot of our own needs for self-preservation. And because of that, I think the real work of prevention comes from making sure that we have really strong and resilient institutions in our society, where we ask our institutions and our governments to be resilient so that people don't have to be resilient, because we know that that's not a burden that we should have to place on individual people. One of the things that that the executive director of the Auschwitz Institute, the organization where I work, which is mostly about working with governments to create policies so that groups of people aren't targeted because of their identity. One of the things he often says is, the work of prevention is the work of creating a world where nobody has to be a hero. And it's really beautiful to think of these moments and to hear the stories of people who stand up and fight actively and even die for their beliefs in these moments. But like I said, we shouldn't have to live in that kind of world. No one should have to be a hero. There shouldn't be moments where people are targeted because of their identity. We need institutions and we need governments that make sure that no one is put into that position. And that's why I think the real work of prevention is looking really far upstream to try and identify those very early stages where groups of people are beginning to be targeted, where we actually have much more room to maneuver and prevent things from escalating. Because if we wait too long, what we know is that it becomes incredibly difficult to stop that snowball from going down the hill when it's already gained so much momentum and speed. So that's what I would say about that.
I don't have anything to add. I just wanted to say kudos to Kerry for that, and especially that point about needing the absolute necessity of having strong institutions, because we know about human psychology and that and what really our biology drives us to do for self-preservation and protecting ourselves and protecting our those close to us. And so it just, to me, really underscores that importance of strong institutions. One of the things that the Nazis did when they came to power beginning in the 1920s, and yes, they formally came to power in 1933, but they were fighting to gain power for a decade or so before that. And one of the things they were doing was not just trying to win over individual followers, they were attacking the legitimacy of democratic institutions in Germany for 12 years. And so this is, as just again what Kerry said, this is a long, gradual process. It doesn't happen overnight.
This is so important, right? One of the things that I do through my work at the Auschwitz Institute is every year we spend a week in Auschwitz with government officials from countries all over the world, and we teach them about what happened during the Holocaust and that process, and then turn to how we can use those lessons to create policies to prevent genocide today. And one of the exercises that I did with them last week when I was in Auschwitz, we're sitting in one of the barracks of the camp, and they learn about the economic and social situation, the very fragile situation in Germany following their defeat in World War I, and the just economic devastation that German citizens were facing during this moment. And we give these government officials the Nazi Party platform from 1920 to read. And if you look this platform up, there are some incredibly objectionable things, of course, but most of the points on this platform are things that most of us would totally agree with and want our politicians to be fighting for, like an end to unemployment, like a pension plan, a retirement plan, like this education for all. And then you get to the final point on this party platform, and this, to Jake's point, what the final point is, in order to accomplish all of these things, what we need is a more centralized and authoritarian national government, right? And that's the point where we can totally disagree on how to accomplish these goals. But the reality is that if most of you looked at the Nazi Party platform from 1920, if you look with empathetic eyes, you could understand how so many Germans would see that, oh, okay, maybe I'm willing to overlook these few anti-Semitic things because all of these other things just sound so good compared to what my life looks like right now. Now, it's a difficult reality to acknowledge, but it's, yeah.
Thank you for that. Another question. I think this is from the chat. could you share your informed opinions about the current transgender erasure here in the United States in this context?
Yeah. I think that the erasing of history has long been a tool by homophobe and transphobe people of all different stripes, but especially far right or ultra nationalist conservatives seek to always represent queer and trans people as not having a history, as being a product of something modern. That's what Kerry was talking about. A lot of these genocidal regimes try to talk about going backwards to a traditional values, and so really, to me, it's no surprise that we are seeing the increase here in the United States of anti-LGBTQ legislation like we have not seen in a long time, and kind of a grassroots and coordinated effort to ban books and to take to social media and claim that queer and trans people weren't victimized by the Nazis, when the reality is real historians who have done the scholarship, who have gone to the archives, who have seen the documents, can prove without a doubt that the Nazis targeted queer and trans people. I think now that now there's kind of a forced, begrudged acceptance from even those on the right that, okay, yes, homosexuals were targeted by the Nazis, but that now the kind of the boogeyman, the group that we're going to try to erase are trans folks. And so now now the discourse on Twitter or X, whatever it's called, is trying to deny the fact that the Nazis went after trans folks. They're absolutely wrong. But I do think that folks like a certain children's book author that will not be named, using her huge platform to share this historical erasure is dangerous on a level that we haven't seen before, because it's now reaching millions of people across the world. And I think it is up to us as the scholars, the educators, to make sure that folks have access to that history, the reliable, reputable history that shows just how wrong they are.
And just to add a little bit to that, I mean, I think one of the things that worries me most today and in the current context in the United States, for instance, is not the erasure of the trans community, but actually conservatives in the US today and these far-right political leaders in the US today. If you listen to them, the trans community is a massive community that's literally waiting at every bathroom door to go in and sexually assault cisgender people going to that bathroom, right? It's actually this gross exaggeration of the presence and power of trans individuals in the United States. And this is not dissimilar to the rhetoric that the Nazis used about the Jewish community in Germany, right? Actually, most people, when they think about the number of German Jews, when Hitler came to power, they think about, Germany must, I ask this question often with my students, so Germany must have had been 10%, 20%, 30% of its population Jewish. Less than 1% of the German population was Jewish, right? 0.75% of Germany were Jewish when Hitler came to power. And yet the Nazis used rhetoric to make it seem like this outsized threat within German society. And that's the thing that actually scares me about the rhetoric around trans people in the United States today, that they're made to seem like this incredibly massive threat to values and to political rights and to the livelihood of non-trans individuals.
And I think Kerry's right on, but like that the erasure of the history absolutely goes hand in hand with that kind of outsized rhetoric, because if you erase the history, you also erase the fact that the rhetoric that folks are using today is almost copy and paste from what the Nazis used back in the day. And so if you erase that part, you erase any type of connection between, you know, the right wing today and the Nazis of 90 years ago. I mean, if you look at for example, the rhetoric of groomers, right? The LGBTQ community, especially the trans community, or groomers, they're going to come after your children. They're going to turn your children trans or gay. Or the Nazis, they talked about the homosexual community, and that was kind of collapsing everyone under that term homosexual. But they put in front page newspapers, they put it in their campaign speeches that homosexuals are going to seduce your children into their lifestyle. Right? This idea that it's not about hating homosexuals, it's about protecting your children. Right? And any good parent, any good German parent wants to protect their child. And so you really need to vote for us, give us the power to protect you and your family, your children from these pedophiles, these people that are coming after your children. It's you know, slightly different vocabulary, but it's the same message of groomers today. And yeah, don't go in the bathroom. They're waiting for you in the bathroom. And so yeah, when you erase what the Nazis said 90 years ago, no one can really be aware that you're using pretty similar arguments today.
Thank you both so much. We have another question for both of you, and it really connects to where we are here in this classroom with some of our students here at Queensborough Community College, and wondering, many of whom are interested in the arts, but all of whom are pursuing education here as a path forward for themselves. And we're wondering what guidance you have for them, you know, to meet today.
Well, I will say, in a world now where everyone has access to the entire internet at their fingertips, providing access to information is no longer the sole purpose of an educator. Like your jobs going forward as educators in multiple kind of medium is more important than ever. It's being able to teach people how to process and analyze and become literate in finding real information. We talked earlier about multiple truths and different types of, or categories of truth, and that one of the things I'm really glad Kerry mentioned is that we can't just throw out historical truth. Like just because people's experiences might be different, we have to have conversations and policies that are built on historical truth and the other truths too. But we have to be able to ground these conversations. And so I think, you know, as educators, we have to be able to help people find those types of truths and stick firm to them. One of the things that I also it's a big challenge for me personally, and I don't have an answer to it yet, and I'm feel like I'm constantly trying to figure it out, is how to reach beyond our own kind of algorithm based bubble, where we feel like we're in echo chambers, and I can say, you know, present facts, but I'm probably presenting them to people who already believe them or have similar thoughts as me or similar interests as me. And I don't know exactly how we can best kind of go beyond the choir and reach people with different perspectives, not necessarily to try to, you know, change their mind and get them on our side, but at least be able to have conversations where we can agree on those historical truths, and then, you know, move forward from there. And so I think that is a challenge that we have to take seriously. And I'm not saying so in the kind of goal of both sidesism of like, well, there's very fine people on all sides and everyone should kind of have their, like, that's not the end goal. But the end goal, like, we do have to be able to reach beyond our own bubbles. And so I just say that is in my mind, one of the most important tasks, and I wish you all the best of luck with it. And I wish I had more concrete guidances like how to do that, but that's something that I think we're all having to work through at this time.
Yeah, I agree completely with Jake. And I would just say, to me, the most important thing that the educational process has to teach people is not skills, specific skills. It's not specific information, but it's training us to be able to think critically about the world around us, and to not accept anything as a given, but to say, okay, for whatever thing we're dealing with, what are the relationships of power behind that phenomenon or behind that thing that might make this thing appear like the right way or the right, and this requires developing a real sense of empathy and learning how to think not only through your own eyes and your own mind, but learning how to hear and listen to others and think about why they think the way that they think as well. I don't know, this to me is the biggest task of education. And by that, I don't mean just education in any formal scenario, but the work of life, making sure that we're exposed to many different ways of thinking about the world so that we question and refine our own way of thinking and understanding the world.
Thank you both so much. We want to invite Dr. Laura Cohen back for some closing remarks.
Thank you.
I am just so grateful to all of you, Jake and Kerry and Julian and Heather. I feel like in many ways this conversation today has been profound and really building on so many of the themes that we're really wrestling with in the United States in particular right now. And recently I had the good fortune to hear for the second time in my life, the civil rights activist Eric Ward. And he wrote a really important article, groundbreaking article in 2017 called Skin in the Game, How Anti-Semitism Animates Racism and White Nationalism. But more than anything, Eric really talks about coalition building. And Jake, what you were talking about, how do we get out of our individual silos? And I think that even in the Jewish community right now, we're really struggling. And Eric said something, he quoted former President Obama, and it's really resonated, which is, he says, "We are the ones we've been waiting for." And in this moment, we're really fighting for an inclusive democracy. We're really fighting to ward off a totalitarian government, an authoritarian government, government that really very much could radically alter our lives. And so for everybody that's on this call, we have to find a way to come together to bring in different communities. And especially, just to kind of recap, Kerry, you talked about atomizing communities and dividing us and these different narratives and holding on to different truths, even when they might be in conflict with one another. And the goal and sort of the legacies of what the Nazis regime in trying to erase us and divide us, and how we find ways to survive and ways to find hope. And that's more than anything what I've taken away from this, is that there is hope. And when we talk about prevention. And so thank you both for just giving so freely of your time and making all these connections for our students, for the Queensborough Community College community, and for everybody that's joined us here today. And on behalf of the Kupferberg Holocaust Center, we thank you so much. We hope you all stay safe and well, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.